Hello viewers, welcome to Bukhara. We are in Bukhara, a city with thousands of years of history and millions of things to talk about. I obviously don't have time to cover them all. Instead, I'm here to just tell one story. A small but important story that happened here in the summer of 1842. It is a story about the deaths of two British officers. As mentioned earlier, like Hiva, Bukhara was also famous for its glamorous buildings and slave trade. And among all the slaves that were traded here, many of them came from Russia. They were captured by either the Turkmen, Kazakh, or Kyrgyz raiders and were brought here for sale. The Russian government sent several expeditions over the years, but all failed because of the desert terrain and the lack of preparation. However, in the 1830s, things started to change. British officers began to show up in all Central Asian colonies and risked their lives to convince the emirs to release the slaves. Not all of them, only the Russian slaves. Well, this might sound strange to you at first. Were the British that concerned about the well-being of the Russians? The answer to that question was obviously no. They couldn't care less about the Russians. But if they didn't care, why were they doing this? To answer this question, we must go back to a very unique period in history, when the Russian Empire and the British Empire were playing the so-called Great Game. From 1800, the Russian Empire expanded rapidly, extending its influence into Transoxiana. Meanwhile, the British had conquered much of the Indian subcontinent and also arrived at the doorstep of Transoxiana. To address the fear of a Russian invasion, the British strengthened their position in India and explored northern regions, hoping to secure India by annexing or controlling neighboring states. In 1809, one British mission reached the Afghan court in Peshawar, where a treaty was signed, ensuring that no foreign European powers would gain a foothold in Afghanistan. However, immediately following the treaty signing, a civil war erupted in Afghanistan, lasting nearly 2 decades until Dost Muhammad's rise to power in 1826. With Afghanistan stabilizing, the British sent envoys to Kabul in 1836 to persuade Dost to accept British tutelage, but the Afghan emir refused. The British were like, okay, we've tried the peaceful approach and that didn't work. Now let's try something else. In 1838, they invaded Afghanistan, starting the First Anglo-Afghan War. By 1839, they had overrun southern Afghanistan, occupying Kandahar and Kabul. Dost surrendered a year later and was sent to Calcutta. At this stage, the British thought the war was over. We got the emir, we got the capital, and we killed a lot of Afghans. Yet the war was over. Except it wasn't, because the real Anglo-Afghan War was only just beginning. Unlike other peoples the British had conquered in the past, the Afghans simply wouldn't accept their presence. The removal of leadership meant absolutely nothing to them, and the war persisted. In the winter of 1842, the British could no longer hold on and were forced to retreat. On their way to Jalalabad, the entire force of 4,500 troops and 12,000 camp followers was either slaughtered or frozen to death. The British commander, General Elphinstone, was captured and died in captivity. The First Anglo-Afghan War ended in a decisive British defeat. After due consideration, the British restored Dost Muhammad to power in 1843. In return, Dost shifted his policy, establishing friendly relations with the British. During his exile in Calcutta, Dost noticed the technological advantage of the British and was convinced that constant wars with them would destroy Afghanistan. The First Anglo-Afghan War drew the attention of all rulers in Central Asia, including the Bukharan Emir, Nasrullah. You see, conquests in the 19th century were not carried out in the same manner as in the 15th or the 16th century. Back then, one could simply sail to a new land, overpower the indigenous people, and claim the territory as their own. However, in the 19th century, a legitimate justification was required for such actions. The Russian Empire had a strong motive to conquer Central Asia, to free Russian slaves who had been held and sold by various rulers in the region for centuries. This provided a legitimate reason for the Russian expansion, and the British were well aware of this. They knew the international community would not oppose the Russian conquest, as they had a valid cause. To counteract this, British officers suggested meeting with the local leaders to try to persuade them to release the Russian slaves first. By removing this reason for expansion, they hoped to slow down the Russian conquest. Some British officers, though, actually made it happen. Lieutenant Richmond Shakespeare convinced the Khan of Khiva to free all Russian slaves under his control, and also to make the ownership of Russian slaves a crime punishable by death. As a result, Russia lost its primary motive for the conquest of Khiva for the time being. However, not all the officers were as fortunate and capable as Lieutenant Richmond Shakespeare. The ones who were sent here in Bukhara faced a very different fate. In 1838, Colonel Charles Stuart was on a mission to persuade the Emir of Bukhara to free Russian slaves and sign a treaty of friendship with Britain. The talk obviously went very wrong. The colonel did not bring any gifts to the Emir, nor did he bring the letter from the Queen. In addition, he violated the local protocol by riding rather than walking up the ark, which is right over there. The Emir was greatly offended by these actions and had the colonel thrown into the jail. 3 years later, in November 1841, Captain Arthur Connolly arrived in Bukhara to try to get the colonel out. He was actually the guy who came up with the term "great game" and spent many years trying unsuccessfully to convince different khanates in the region to set aside their disputes and join forces against the Russians. But the Emir of Bukhara believed him to be part of the British plot, with the Khans of Khiva and Kokand tossed him in jail as well. After the disastrous British retreat from Kabul and having received no reply to an earlier letter to Queen Victoria, the Emir had both men executed. On June 24, 1842, Colonel Charles Stuart and Captain Arthur Connolly were marched out from a dungeon cell in front of a huge crowd, made to dig their own graves, and were beheaded right here in this square. You know, sometimes stories like this make you wonder what will ever be enough for people. The British Empire, the Russian Empire, two of the largest empires ever to exist, fought for supremacy from Europe all the way to Asia, trying to establish more control and gain more land, more and more and more. So many people like Colonel Stuart and Captain Connolly sacrificed their lives for this cause. And the fate of this entire region was changed forever, because the Queen and the Tsar
wanted to play a game. You know, the great game offers us a lens to view both our competitive and cooperative tendencies. Well, it exemplifies a fundamental human desire to expand territories, gain influence, and exert control over others. It also exemplifies our ability to cooperate with others when it serves our interests. The great game never truly ceased and will go on indefinitely.
Despite British efforts, the fear of Russian expansion into Transoxiana came true. After controlling the Kazakh steppe, the Russian military hoped to find a natural frontier beyond the steppe in Transoxiana. Starting in 1839, they expanded south from two directions, the Orenburg Line and the Siberian Line. In the west, the Russians built fortresses and supply lines along the Aral Sea and Sidonia. In 1853, they captured the fortress of Akhmasjid from Kokand, gaining a foothold in Transoxiana. In the east, the Siberian line began with the construction of forts at Kopol in 1847 and Vilny in 1854. Just as they planned to connect the two forts, the Crimean War escalated. Russia paused all its expansion plans, sending over 1 million soldiers to the front lines, and suffered a devastating defeat. The war ended in 1856. Over 450,000 Russians died, including Tsar Nicholas I. To restore its prestige, Russia resumed military actions in Transoxiana in 1860 and captured Tokmak and Bishkek in 1861. By 1865, Russia had seized Turkestan, Shymkent, Aulia Ata, and Tashkent. After the fall of Tashkent, the Russians made it the anchor of a natural frontier, linking the Orenburg and Siberian fortifications. In 1865, Russia created the Turkestan district, which became a province 2 years later with Tashkent as its capital. For the next 125 years, until the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, Tashkent would remain the center of Russian power in Central Asia. Meanwhile, despite the victory over Russia in the Crimean War, the British faced an imminent crisis in South Asia. On May 10, 1857, Indian soldiers of the East India Company mutinied, sparking a nationwide uprising. The rebels sought to restore Mughal rule and end British domination. The uprising, which lasted until 1859, led to the deaths of over 6,000 British and approximately 800,000 Indians. Following this, the British Empire ended the East India Company's rule, took direct control of India, and established the British Raj. As the British re-established control over India, the Qing Empire lost its control over Xinjiang. Starting in the 1840s, both Kokand and Qing faced constant turmoil. This chaos allowed the Hojas to act freely. From 1847 to 1857, at least 7 descendants of the Jahangir Hoja launched multiple campaigns on Kashgar. The Tarim Basin was devastated. Things got worse in the 1860s when rumors spread that the Qing Emperor had ordered the extermination of Hui Muslims. Overnight, millions of Hui Muslims rose up against the Qing government. In 1864, the revolt reached Xinjiang, where Muslims of all ethnicities joined forces, stormed citadels, and massacred Han Manchu populations. Amid the chaos, the Russian army sneaked in and occupied the Ili Valley for nearly 2 decades. In Kashgar, the Qing governor massacred the Hui Muslims and asked the Kyrgyz for reinforcement. The Kyrgyz arrived but wanted Kashgar for themselves and asked Kokand for reinforcement. And Kokand, despite being under Russian attack, sent the leading Apache Hoja berserk to Kashgar with an army led by Yakub Bek.
Yakub was born in the city not far from Tashkent, orphaned at a young age, and was raised to be a weaver. However, the young man didn't want to be a weaver, and instead chose to work under a military general. By the early 1860s, he had already become a prominent figure in the Fergana Valley. And just as he rose to prominence, 2 things happened. First of all, the Russians began attacking the Khanate of Kokand and quickly captured Tashkent. Yaqub was actually there defending Tashkent himself, and he quickly realized that his country was about to be annexed. Second of all, the neighboring Qing Empire was facing serious issues, and Western China suddenly became unstable. Facing these two realities, Yaqub and his supporters made the obvious choice: cross the Chinese border. With the help of Kokandin soldiers who fled Fergana Valley after the fall of Tashkent, Yaqub established his control over the Tarim Basin in 1865 and founded the Jatishar. And since all this happened during the Great Game, of course, the British and the Russians were involved. In 1872, Jatishar established diplomatic relations with the Russian Empire. The following year, in 1873, Jatishar became a protectorate of the Ottoman Empire. And in 1874, it established diplomatic relations with the British Empire. The Qing Empire never recognized it and sent an army to crush it. Yaqub died in May 1877. Shortly after his death, the Qing Empire reconquered this region and Jatishar collapsed. The leading general was a guy called Zuo Zongtang, and he was perhaps one of the most famous Chinese in the West. You can find his name in literally every Chinese restaurant outside of China, because the popular dish, Zuo Zongtang's chicken, General Zuo's chicken, was named after this guy. Anyways, that's just another tale from the Fergana Valley. Like I said, a lot had happened here.
While Qing troops struggled to regain control of Xinjiang, the Russians were easily taking over Central Asia. By 1868, they had subjugated Bukhara and Kokand. In 1869, they landed on the eastern shore of the Caspian Sea and founded Krasnoyarsk. In 1873, they captured Khiva. Until then, Russia's victories had been swift, with minimal casualties. But that was about to change. In 1879, the Russian army attacked the Turkmens from Krasnoyarsk. As Russian forces advanced, the entire population of the oasis sought refuge in a fortress near Goktepe. The Russians bombarded the fortress and killed about 2,000 fleeing civilians. Furious, the Turkmens charged out and killed nearly 200 Russians, forcing them to retreat. Tsar Alexander II was livid. He personally oversaw the planning of a new campaign and ordered the construction of the Trans-Caspian Railway to aid mobilization. In November 1880, General Mikhail Skobeliev led another Russian army to Goktepe. The Turkmens again sheltered in the fortress, but on January 24, 1881, the Russians blew up the city wall, killing tens of thousands of people regardless of sex or age, sparing only 5,000 women and children. Skobeliev later told a British journalist, "I hold it as a principle that in Asia, the duration of peace is in direct proportion to the slaughter you inflict on the enemy. The harder you hit them, the longer they will be quiet afterward. We killed nearly 20,000 Turkmens at Goktepe. The survivors will not soon forget the lesson." Exactly as he said, the slaughter broke the Turkmen resistance, allowing Russian forces to advance deeper into the desert. Over the next 4 years, they captured Ashgabat, Tijan, Merv, and Ulatan, eventually reaching Afghanistan, a puppet state of the British Empire.
Oh, hello viewers. I'm currently at Western Xinjiang, and about 100 kilometers down that way is perhaps the most peculiar border in Asia, the Sino-Afghanistan border. Unbeknownst to most, Afghanistan has a very strange-looking panhandle which goes all the way to here. It is known as the Wakhan Corridor. The total length of the border is only about 92 kilometers long, but this corridor itself is about 400 kilometers long, with 100 kilometers in China, which is where I'm standing right now, and 300 kilometers in Afghanistan. The average altitude of the corridor is way above 4,000 meters, making it only snow-free in June, July, and August. This corridor behind me is one of the poorest and the most uninhabited regions in the world. North of the corridor is Tajikistan, and south of the corridor is Pakistan-controlled Kashmir. This is where the four countries meet. And while I'm here, I'd like to explain to you why this corridor matters so much.
Following the First Anglo-Afghan War, Emir Dost Muhammad spent the rest of his reign consolidating control over Afghanistan while maintaining friendly ties with the British. To keep the Afghans on their side, the British promised non-interference and granted Dost an annual subsidy of 100,000 rupees to maintain the defense against Iran and Russia. To the British, the question now was how Afghanistan was to be dominated. While the liberals wanted to manipulate its politics to block Russian influence, the conservatives wanted to annex it into the Raj. When Dost Muhammad died in 1863, his third son, Sher Ali, became the new emir. Although he got along with the two governors-general of India, his requests for support against Russia and for recognition of his dynasty were ignored. Things went from bad to worse in 1874 when the Conservatives took office in London. The Conservatives abandoned the Liberals' policy of non-interference and called for tighter control over Afghanistan. In 1876, they appointed Robert Lytton as Governor-General of India, who wasted no time militarizing northern India and pushing for a British mission in Kabul. Sher Ali resisted, arguing that if he allowed a British mission in Kabul, the Russians would demand the same treatment. Tensions escalated in 1878. That year, to test the British, the Russians sent a mission to Kabul without Sher Ali's permission, and he granted them entry. Lytton then sent a counter-mission, but was blocked by the emir. In retaliation, Lytton ordered the invasion of Afghanistan, starting the Second Anglo-Afghan War. Facing the British invasion, the Russians withdrew, and Sher Ali abdicated in favor of his son, Yaqub. In May 1879, Yaqub signed the Treaty of Gandamak and surrendered the sovereignty of Afghanistan to Britain. When the Afghans learned of this, they rebelled again, killing British officers and troops. Yaqub abdicated and fled to India. After the rebels were crushed, the British sent in Abdul Rahman, a nephew of Sher Ali who was living in exile in Russian Turkestan. Rahman arrived in Kabul in the summer of 1880 in a Russian uniform with Russian arms and supplies. But the British gambled on him and made him the new emir of Afghanistan. As Britain had calculated, the new emir played his role fairly well. From 1883, he received an annual subsidy of 1.2 million rupees to maintain his troops and protect Afghanistan's northwestern borders. In exchange, he handed over the sovereignty of Afghanistan. Meanwhile, Russia, having just conquered the Turkmens, showed up at the Afghan border. This brought a long-standing question between the two empires to a head. Where do we draw the border of Afghanistan? The British were particularly concerned about the undefined border south of Merv, as the Merv, Herat, Kandahar, and Quetta line was a key invasion route to India. With the construction of the Trans-Caspian Railway, Russian troops and supplies could quickly reach Merv, threatening the Raj. At that time, it was commonly accepted that Afghanistan's northwestern border began at Sarax on the Persian frontier. But in March 1885, Russia captured that area from the Afghans. Alarmed, the British stepped in. Their message was clear. If Russia made any move towards Herat, Great Britain would treat it as a declaration of war. To avoid a full-blown Anglo-Russian war, the two powers sat down and negotiated a border in the northwest. In 1890, Russia established Kushka at the southern edge of this territory, marking the southernmost point of the Russian Empire, later the Soviet Union, and today's Turkmenistan. In 1891, the northeastern boundary was settled, with both sides agreeing that Amudarya would separate Russian territory from Afghan territory. The narrow Wakhan corridor remained part of Afghanistan so that the two empires did not touch at any point. And that was the end of Russian expansion to the south. It wasn't stopped by any natural frontier, but by the presence of another superpower. After the demarcation of the Russo-Afghan border, The next boundary drawn was between the Raj and Afghanistan, the Durand Line, established in 1893. Today, the Durand Line remains the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan and has been a point of contention since its creation. Another boundary followed in 1904, dividing Iran and Afghanistan in Sistan. This boundary favored the Afghans. Well, naturally, the Iranians were very upset, but they couldn't do anything about it. It wasn't even drawn by the Afghans. It was drawn by the British. The final settlement occurred with the Convention of 1907. Both powers agreed that Afghanistan was outside the Russian sphere of influence, that Britain would not annex any part of Afghanistan or interfere in its internal affairs, and that Russia would consult Britain on anything relating to Russo-Afghan relations. Modern Afghanistan had thus been formed. For the time being, the British were relieved. The threat that had haunted them for nearly a century was gone. India was finally safe from Russia. Yet, little did the British know, their time in India was about to run out. For all colonial powers, colonization went hand in hand with assimilation. Through assimilation, colonizers created a cultural bond that helped reduce resistance and legitimize their rule. Both the British and the Russians were experts in assimilating others. Their vast territories had provided them with plenty of experience. In 1857, the British established 3 universities in India: the University of Calcutta, the University of Bombay, and the University of Madras. Modeled after British institutions, these universities emphasized English literature and European history. By 1911, there were 186 universities and colleges of higher education in India, enrolling 36,000 students. In 1854, the British Raj planned a railway network. Investment flowed in, leading to the rapid expansion of the railway system in India. Between 1860 and 1890, India's railway grew from 1,349 kilometers to over 25,000 kilometers. By the late 19th century, the railway network in India was the 4th largest in the world. Another vital infrastructure was irrigation system. In 1800, only 800,000 hectares were irrigated in India. Over the course of 100 years, the British built canals and irrigation systems across India, and by 1900, the Raj had the largest irrigation system in the world. The irrigation system also guaranteed a steady supply of opium for China. By 1850, the Ganges Plains had nearly 1,000 square kilometers of poppy farms. Within 50 years, that number doubled to 2,000 square kilometers, generating unimaginable wealth for the empire. British influence also extended into Afghan society. In the 1860s and 70s, Emir Sher Ali tried to adopt British-style institutions. He created a new elite outside his own clan, raised a modern army, and aimed for merit-based governance. Yet, his soldiers were more loyal to their tribes, and his officials didn't share his vision. Reform is all about timing, and Sher Ali was ahead of his. While the British brought modern education, technology, and all kinds of institutions to South Asia, they also introduced discrimination and caused serious damage. The Raj, driven by profit, left most Indians poor, while famines and pandemics claimed tens of millions of lives. There was always tension between the Indians and the British. The Afghans, too, never stopped resisting, and the British faced the strongest opposition from the tribes along the newly drawn Durand Line. The Mohmand tribe living on Afghanistan's southern frontier had been resisting the British since the 1850s. With the Durand Line splitting their homeland, tribal leaders feared annexation and attacked British positions in the summer of 1897. In response, the British sent an expedition and crushed the uprising within months. Among the expedition was a 23-year-old second lieutenant who volunteered as a war correspondent. That young man would return home, enter politics, and serve as the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom from 1940 to 1945, forever changing Europe's fate. His name was Winston Churchill. The Russians divided Central Asia into 3 areas: the Steppe Krai, Turkestan, and 2 protectorates. the Khanate of Khiva, and the Emirate of Bukhara. In the Kazakh steppe, the Russians abolished the Khans. In Turkestan, they removed the local elites. The two remaining rulers, the Khivan Khan and the Bukharan Emir, were allowed to keep their thrones but lost their independence. Islam, the main threat to Russian rule in Central Asia, was handled with care. Islamic law and institutions were left untouched, as the Russians did not want to provoke the Muslims. As a result, Islam thrived, and Islamic scholars, the ulama, enjoyed unprecedented prestige and authority in societies. Prior to Russian rule, the local elites had kept the ulama on a tight leash for centuries. Now, with the elites removed, the ulama were off the leash. Under Tsarist rule, Central Asia became a unified political space as never before and enjoyed a period of peace and development. Unlike the British, who faced frequent uprisings in India and Afghanistan, the Russians, up until 1916, faced only one major rebellion in Andijan in 1898 and lost 22 Russian soldiers. Once stability was achieved, Russia began assimilating the local population, starting with the nomads. This process began in the mid-18th century when steppe fortresses like Orsk, Semipalatinsk, Vienny, and Pishbek became Russian settlements and common destinations for Russian exiles. On May 19, 1854, Semipalatinsk was designated as the capital of the Semipalatinsk Oblast.
Over the years, this region has produced many important Kazakh writers, teachers, and thinkers, including the one and only Lullabye. As a matter of fact, this entire region, Lullabye region, is named after him. For those of you who are unfamiliar with his name, think of it as Shakespeare, an icon in the history of both Kazakhstanis and Russians. He translated a lot of Kazakh work into Russian, and at the same time translated a lot of Russian work into Kazakh. So he was sort of a bridge connecting both peoples. Lullabye was also very pro-Russian, and because of that, the Russian government made sure he remains popular.
Among the exiles and criminals sent to Semipalatinsk was Fyodor Dostoevsky, who spent about 5 years there, served in the Russian army, taught local children, and met his first wife. So this building behind me is the museum for Dostoevsky in Semi, and the wooden house right next to it was where Dostoevsky, his wife, and his baby used to live from 1857 to 1859. Over time, nomads living near these cities adopted the Russian language and customs, with many sending their children to Russian schools. By the mid-19th century, there were already many Kazakh and Kyrgyz soldiers in the Russian army. They fought alongside the Russians and embraced Russian culture. One notable figure was Shokan Vatikanov, the great-grandson of Ablai Khan. He was a renowned scholar, spy, and close friend of Fyodor Dostoevsky. However, assimilation proved harder in Turkestan. Here, Russians and Muslims lived side by side with limited interaction. Russian schools were established, but Muslim parents rarely sent their sons, fearing the loss of their culture and religion. In 1884, Russian native schools were established, which offered a basic Russian curriculum in the morning and Islamic lessons in the afternoon, but even these schools had a hard time getting students. Nevertheless, Turkestan was modernized. The first printing press was established in 1870, telegraph lines arrived in 1873, and the first bank opened in 1875. The first track was laid during the final conquest of the Turkmens and reached Tashkent by 1898. It later extended into the Fergana Valley. This rail system connected Central Asia to steamships on the Caspian, Aral, and Black Seas. By 1910, a direct line to Russia proper was completed. During the Tsarist period, two major irrigation projects were developed in Central Asia, one in Transcaspia and another in the Kazakh steppe. The latter was in part the work of the exiled Grand Duke Nikolai Konstantinovich. The guy had stolen from his family to pay for his affairs, and when caught, he was banished to Turkestan. Here he made himself useful and focused on improving irrigation systems. When I was in Tashkent, I went to his house. It wasn't really in great shape, but for a house that is over 150 years old, it looked magnificent.
This is where he lived. He lived on the left side of the house, and his wife lived on the right side, the right wing of the house. Yeah. And now this place is a reception center for Uzbekistan Foreign Ministry. Interesting. Well, at least he died old age. Unlike Nicholas II, unlike Alexander III, unlike Alexander II, who all died a very unusual deaths.
But the biggest transformation the Russians brought to Central Asia, which is still affecting the region's economy, was neither the rails nor the canals, but a crop: cotton. Cotton had been grown in Transoxiana long before the Russian conquest, but the local variety was not suitable for high-quality clothes. In the 1860s, as the United States fought a civil war, the cotton supply suddenly became unstable. Russia wanted to establish its own cotton industry. They sent experts to Texas and brought back new cotton varieties. One of them, upland cotton, thrived beyond all expectations. By the late 19th century, cotton had become the most important commodity in Turkestan. However, Central Asia wasn't the only region Russified. The neighboring Xinjiang was also Russified. After its reconquest, Xinjiang remained alien and poor. The Qing Empire didn't have any resources to develop Xinjiang. There were no railways, irrigation systems, or any effective sanitization programs. Meanwhile, in 1881, Treaty of St. Petersburg allowed Russia to open 4 consulates and trade freely in the province. As a result, the Russians dominated Xinjiang's economy. Cheap Russian goods flooded the bazaars, and the ruble became the most stable and widely accepted currency. Upland cotton was introduced and became extremely popular among the Uyghur peasants. Before 1912, Russian post offices in Xinjiang were the only way to connect with the global postal system. News from abroad all came via Russian Turkestan. The new merchant class in Xinjiang looked to Russia for inspiration, and tens of thousands of landless Uyghurs traveled to Turkestan for higher wages. Most went to the Fergana Valley to work in the cotton industry. By the early 20th century, Xinjiang was more of a Russian colony than a Chinese province. Even today, Russian influence are still visible in Xinjiang. In cities like Tarbakh, Kurcha, and Borchin, you can find Russian buildings, graveyards, Orthodox churches, former Russian consulates, and schools. If you're lucky, you might even run into a few Russian Chinese. You probably find it hard to believe how the British, literally oceans away from home, managed to colonize the vast Indian subcontinent for centuries. Well, they did fight many wars, but let's be honest here. Military power alone couldn't possibly rule such a large, distant, and diverse territory for such a long time. So the British must have come up with something new, something that allowed them to control distant territories in a much more cost-effective way. You see, at first glance, it might seem like this entire region was under British rule. But if you take a closer look, you will realize that only this much of the subcontinent was directly controlled by the British. The rest were controlled by entities called princely states, where local rulers retained some power but had to follow British policies. Those princely states took the British many years to set up. Because we're talking about colonization here. Obviously, not all the rulers were okay with this arrangement, particularly the Muslim rulers, who had historically been in power under the Mughals. So, to handle this, the British would support uprisings against the established Muslim rulers. Once the old Muslim powers were weakened, the British would usually help install more cooperative Hindu rulers who were less likely to resist British authority. Through these highly flexible puppet regimes, the British colonized the Indian subcontinent in just a few decades, which led to an increase in Hindu rulers and a decrease in Muslim rulers. In 1765, Muslims ruled the grain areas on the map. By 1805, their territories had been reduced to this. By 1837, they were further reduced to this, and by 1857 to this. As their power declined, the Muslims became more and more reliant on British protection. By the mid-19th century, the Muslims, once expected to be the least loyal subjects, had become the most loyal supporters of the Raj. The 1857 mutiny was a pivotal moment in India's history. Seeing the dissolution of the East India Company, Muslims in India feared the end of the British rule and the rise of Hindu power. The Muslims were like, folks, before the British leave, we've got to figure out our next move. To them, it was a matter of life and death. One prominent Muslim leader, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, came up with the two-nation theory, arguing that Indian Muslims and Indian Hindus are two separate nations with different customs, traditions, and ways of life. He famously said, suppose that the English community and the army were to leave India, taking with them all their cannons and their splendid weapons and all else. Who then would be the rulers of India? Is it possible that under these circumstances, two nations, the Mohammedans and the Hindus, could sit on the same throne and remain equal in power? Most certainly not. It is necessary that one of them should conquer the other. To hope that both could remain equal is to desire the impossible and the inconceivable. But until one nation has conquered the other and made it obedient, peace cannot reign in the land. During his career, Sir Syed repeatedly called upon the Muslims to loyally serve the British, promoted Western-style education, and founded the Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College in 1875, the first Muslim university in South Asia. Sayyid Amir Ali, another key figure in Muslim nationalism, also urged his followers to remain loyal to the British and promote English education. In 1877, he founded the Central National Mohammedan Association, which grew to 34 branches nationwide. Although the association eventually declined, it paved the way for the formation of one of the most powerful Muslim organizations that ever existed, the All India Muslim League. In contrast to the Muslims, Hindus were gaining prominence. By 1887, of 21,000 mid-level civil service positions, 45% were held by Hindus, 29% by Europeans, 19% by Eurasians, and only 7% by Muslims. With a population 5 times larger than the Muslim population, the Hindus dominated daily administration, universities, politics, and the judiciary. In many regions, the British even acceded to Hindu demands, making Hindi the official language. In addition, there was a cultural renaissance and growing national pride among Hindus. While Muslim leaders remained loyal to the British, Hindu leaders grew increasingly hostile, accusing Britain of draining India's wealth. In 1885, the Indian National Congress was founded, led by prominent Hindu leaders. Though the Congress sought to unite Hindus and Muslims in their fight for independence, most Muslim leaders did not trust it. Then came the pivotal year of 1905, when the great state of Bengal was split in two. Bengal was one of the oldest, largest, and most populated regions in the Raj. It was a crossroads where Hinduism met Islam. Administering such a diverse region had always been a challenge for the British. East Bengal had long been populated mostly by Muslims, while West Bengal had long been populated mostly by Hindus. For decades, East Bengal was neglected and underdeveloped, with all educational, administrative, and professional opportunities centered in the capital of West Bengal, Calcutta. As a result, Muslims in East Bengal lacked education and were dominated and in some cases even oppressed by Hindu landlords and moneylenders. Even today, East Bengal, not Bangladesh, is still struggling. So to improve administration in East Bengal, Lord Curzon, the Viceroy of India, decided to partition Bengal on October 16, 1905. The split separated the largely Muslim eastern region from the largely Hindu western region, with a new capital in Dhaka. Hindus were livid and sought partition as a divide and rule strategy. It sparked nationwide opposition and radical nationalism. Bengali writer Tagore commented, "The partition has inflicted a deep wound upon the soul of Bengal, one that shall bleed in the hearts of Bengalis for generations to come." October 16, 1905 stands as a solemn day of national mourning for Bengal. The Muslims, on the other hand, absolutely loved the idea. The partition promised better political representation, autonomy, and protection of their interests. The new center in Dhaka would also make the Muslims less dependent on Calcutta. During the partition, the Indian National Congress increasingly aligned with Hindu nationalist groups, openly pursuing a pro-Hindu agenda. To counter this, Muslims formed the All India Muslim League in 1906. The League pushed for political representation and cultural autonomy for the Muslims under British rule, with its first objective being to promote among the Muslims of India feelings of loyalty to the British government. However, Muslim loyalty to the British was not going to last very long, because just 5 years after the Bengal partition, the British reversed it. Seeing nationwide protests and uprisings, the British gave in. On December 12, 1911, King George V, while visiting Delhi, announced Bengal's reunification. Despite this, the damage to Hindu-Muslim-British relations was done. The Hindus were still mad at the British, while the Muslims felt betrayed. They saw the reunification as the government compromising Muslim interests to appease Hindus. Although the idea of a separate Muslim-majority region was not immediately realized, it became a fundamental issue for future Muslim leaders. In 1913, the All India Muslim League ended its loyalty to the British and began advocating for an independent Muslim state. This change prompted a 46-year-old lawyer from Karachi, a member of the Indian National Congress, to join the League. 2 years later, another 46-year-old lawyer, after spending over 2 decades in South Africa, returned to India and joined the Indian National Congress. Both men would go on to lead the Indian independence movement. Their names were Jinnah and Gandhi, and the rest is history. Following the demarcation, Afghanistan was secured from foreign invasion. With British support, Emir Abdul Rahman focused on unifying and Pashtunizing the country, killing and exiling many people in the process. Rahman established strict control over the country and kept Afghanistan isolated from modern technologies like railways or telegraphs, adopting only innovations that strengthened his army. Thanks to British backing and his own caution, Abdul Rahman was one of the few Afghan leaders to die peacefully in power. Upon his death in 1901, his son Habibullah inherited a stable Afghanistan. Habibullah continued his father's authoritarian rule, but allowed for some reforms. In 1903, he founded Habibia College, which produced future leaders, including a king, 4 presidents, a prime minister, and a defense minister of Afghanistan. Habibullah also launched the bi-weekly Persian journal, Light of the News, and married his 2 sons to the daughters of the journal's chief editor, Mahmud Tarz. Tarz had spent 22 years in Damascus and was closely associated with the Ottoman Young Turk movement. He used the journal to promote reformist ideas and formed the Young Afghans, an anti-British and pro-Turkish group. Among his followers were Habibullah's sons, the future kings of Afghanistan. In 1907, during his first official trip to the Raj, Habibullah married an Afghan princess. Her family had been exiled to India by Habibullah's father, but was now allowed to return. This included her 3 brothers, Mahmud Nader Khan, Mahmud Hashim, and Shah Wali Khan. Born and raised in British India, fluent in Urdu, and educated by the British, these brothers were about to change the history of Afghanistan. Central Asia also entered a new phase. Trains and steamships brought books and newspapers from around the world. These new patterns of goods, people, and ideas broadened the horizons of Central Asians. By the early 20th century, a new generation had grown up under Russian rule and was eager to bring changes to their societies. Drawing inspiration from the Crimean Tatars and Ottomans, a reform movement known as Jadidism began in Turkestan. The Muslim reformers, the Jadids, wanted to create an enlightened society that could compete with the Europeans. To achieve this, they established new massive schools, wrote textbooks, and created bookstores, reading rooms, and their own newspapers. These efforts gave Turkestan its first public space for cultural discussion, introducing new forms of writing, satire, and cartoons. Alongside modernism emerged the concept of nationalism. Traditionally, Central Asians identified with lineage or dynasty, and the idea of a nation was quite new. However, the Jadids now saw all of Turkestan as their motherland, advocating for reforms not only in major cities like Bukhara, Samarkand, Tashkent, Khiva, but throughout the region. Unsurprisingly, Jadidism was strongly opposed by most of Turkestan's ulama. They accused the Jadids' embrace of modernity and secularism of compromising religious integrity. The Jadids, on the other hand, argued that Muslims had strayed from true Islam and blamed the ulama for not guiding people to reform. In the Kazakh steppe, reform took a different course. At the turn of the 20th century, a group of young Russian-educated Kazakhs formed the Kazakh intelligentsia. These Kazakh reformers faced less opposition than their counterparts in Turkestan. The ulama held little power in the steppe, and there was no strong merchant class supporting traditional values. Their main concern was the loss of Kazakh lands. Following the conquest of Turkestan, the Russian government viewed the Kazakh steppe as an underpopulated area suitable for settlers from Russia proper. Therefore, to relieve population pressure and further Russify the steppe, the government began a project of planned settlement. Between 1885 and 1913, over 5 million Slavic peasants moved to Siberia and the Kazakh steppe. As more land was cultivated, the nomadic lifestyle was disrupted, forcing many Kazakhs to settle and take up farming. The influx of settlers also transformed the demographics and landscape of the steppe, making nomadism unviable. This angered the Kazakhs, and the reformers were determined to fight for their rights. In their struggle, the Kazakh intelligentsia embraced nationalism, imagining the Kazakhs as a unified nation. They wrote new histories that saw all Kazakhs as a part of a single community with common descent, focusing on their Turkic roots instead of their Mongol ties. Then came 1905, the year when things started falling apart. You know, there are times when it feels like the universe just decides to throw all the things at once. While the British were handling the partition of Bengal, the Russian army in the Far East was getting destroyed by the Japanese. Then, on Sunday, January 9, 1905, a group of workers who came to deliver a petition were shot by soldiers guarding the Winter Palace. This triggered wave after wave of strikes and demands for political liberalization. By October, Tsar Nicholas II was forced to grant civil liberties. The following spring, he introduced a quasi-constitution and established the State Duma. Russia entered a new era with legal political parties, a freer press, and popular representation. Despite these changes, the Jadid's petitions for reforms and the Kazakhs' petitions to limit Russian settlement were all ignored. The Duma also failed to represent their interests because the rule of difference didn't go away. However, the rights to a free press and assembly remained, and the struggle between modernity and tradition, secularism and religion continued in Central Asia. Meanwhile, Europe was heading toward a big bloody war, the deadliest the world had yet seen. The nearly identical monarchs, King George V of the United Kingdom and his cousin Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, were about to be swept into the storm, and only one of them would survive the chaos.